Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We'll let a couple of you join from the waiting area. Thanks for hopping on this awesome webinar for us. We are excited to talk to you today about tracking and measurement, multi-touchpoint funnels. And this is our healthcare edition, so we will be talking a lot about healthcare. And I think a lot of you are in the healthcare industry, so we're excited to hear your questions as we go along. Welcome, Scott. Welcome, Paige. Welcome, Lauren. Hi, Cindy. Hi, Gretchen. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are so happy that you can make it here. I think we're going to have a really great webinar for you. Hey, Erin. Thanks for joining us today. All right. And we know we're probably going to take about the full 45 minutes to go over Brett's presentation. And then we're going to take some question and answers. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good morning. Welcome to our workshop webinar series. Today's topic, tracking and measurement for multi-touchpoint funnels, the healthcare edition. I'm Carolyn Chavetta, Business Development Manager for Anvil Analytics and Insights, and we are excited to have you join us for the next hour. Before I hand it over to our presenter, Brett, I want to provide some background on Anvil. So we were named the fastest growing company in all of St. Louis by the St. Louis Business Journal last October, and it's still kind of blowing our minds. We are a full service agency. We specialize in creating impactful outcomes through data. The insights that data can provide us help guide our clients into more meaningful ways to measure KPIs, track budget effectiveness, and move the needle where it matters most to our clients. With our development, analytics, strategy, paid, and design teams, we can provide measurement for planning and auditing, growth strategy and implementation, as well as growth management and optimization. And if all of those words sound a little bit too overwhelming, reach out to me with any questions. I will be posting my contact information in the chat section of the webinar. So let's meet your presenter. Brett Lohmeyer is our Director of Analytics and Data Science for Anvil, and will be leading the conversation today. But before I give it over to him, just a few housekeeping tips. As Brett works his way through the presentation, feel free to send over any questions or comments using that Q&A button at the very bottom. Click that chat button if you want to just give some general feedback along the way. And in fact, if you all want to just say hi in the group chat right now, drop your name and organization, and we would love to welcome you. So we've got JV, we've got Jay, hey Lauren, hey John, hey Jessica, hey Aaron. Again, so glad you guys could join us today. I'm also going to be sharing our YouTube channel. Guys, this is big. We have a YouTube channel. All of our videos are maybe 2-3 minutes long. I think our longest video is 5 or 6 minutes. They are sharing, our decision science team are sharing some really cool, quick notes about what you can do, walking you through step-by-step things in Google Tag Manager, things in Data Studio. It is awesome. You're going to love it. I'm going to share that link with you. Be sure to check it out. Don't worry about taking notes feverishly. We will be sending over a recording of this presentation in the email you registered with. So with that, I don't think we have any other housekeeping notes. Scott, thanks so much for saying hi. We are going to hand it over to Brett. Brett, it's all you.
Hey, thank you, Carolyn. So this is kind of a big topic, and I could probably talk for hours about many of the issues in it. So I'm only going to basically cover it from a high level, but try to touch on a lot of different things, and then go deep on a couple things within it. And today, my goal is to focus on some of the most common issues when dealing with multi-touch funnels for your web experience. We're primarily looking at healthcare organizations today, as they tend to run into a lot of problems with third-party tools for scheduling appointments, tools like MyChart, and then concerns with things like personal health information, PHI. So let's get started by going back to the beginning. So the web really started when I was in high school, and it kind of looked something like this. So about 24 years ago, Space Jam, the movie, came out, for those who remember, and with it, a website. And like all websites at the time, it was sort of like a brochure type website. You couldn't really interact. You could just kind of go from page to page. browsing through it. If you're lucky, you had a really strong connection, you can maybe download a wave of I Believe I Could Fly or something like that. Today, websites have grown a lot, but to be fair, this Space Jam website is actually still available. You still can download those wave files today if you want. So don't run away right now, but maybe after this, you guys can go check out Space Jam. So kind of in that same vein, so like as websites started to become a part of everyone's life, analytics tools started to pop up. So tools like Urchin, Web Trends, Omniture, they allowed you to view all kinds of data about your website. So the interesting too, like Space Jam, Web Trends, which was providing analytics all the way back in 1993, it's still available today. And even the tools like Omniture, it's now known as Adobe Analytics, and Urchin, which we're looking at right now, is now called Google Analytics. So a lot of these tools have been around for a long time and growing with the web. And when it really comes to the web experience, one of the biggest changes that how we track data and it comes from a shift in the emergence of smartphones and tablets. And the significance is we found users behave very differently based on the device type they're using, especially in healthcare. So two common differences are in scheduling physician appointments and then in recruitment. So people that are scheduling appointments with their healthcare providers online are often doing it from their smartphones. And this is especially true if users are trying to find an opening the same day for, say, urgent care. The interesting thing is this preference for things like recruitment, like nurse recruitment, kind of switch from mobile over to desktop in that situation. And a lot of that, even though most of the traffic is coming to the recruitment sites from mobile, users are actually much more likely to apply for a job on their desktop computer than a mobile. And you might say, why does this matter? And the key in this, the kind of multi-touch situation is that these aren't different people, right? You don't have a system where like, oh, I only use my smartphone or I only use desktop. They're all the same people, just in different situations. But your analytics tool might be saying, this is a completely different thing, and we need a whole different experience for desktop and mobile users, and not realizing people are moving from one device to the other. But of course, that's not the only issue that we've run into. So Carolyn's going to put out a poll here.
So a little housekeeping note, if you don't see the poll right now, you may need to exit out of full screen mode. We're wondering if sometimes the window gets stuck behind the other window, but join us on taking that poll. Looks like a couple of you have already started taking that, and we'll give it back to Brett.
Okay, yeah. So I guess the poll is really about, you know, everybody probably has a website, but you probably have other websites that link to your sites, or your site links to and interacts with. So this is for scheduling events, appointments, donations, classes, etc. In many organizations, it's not uncommon to find a need for third-party services. They're usually specialty functionality, and it requires a lot of technical features like signing up for events or job boards where users need to apply for these jobs. And in healthcare, we almost always find the need for these third-party services. Not only do healthcare organizations need to hire a lot of people all of the time, but they're also running a lot of classes and events. And I know my wife and I, we attended several events before our first daughter was born about 5 years ago. And we even, we made my parents go to a grandparents class. And they weren't super excited about it, but they went, and they learned a few things. So basically now we have all these different device types breaking up a user experience. And we have all of these different websites and applications breaking up the user's experience. But even this, where we have like a couple of different things and you're moving from one side to the other, is probably not very common for most of you. And I don't know if Carolyn, do you have the results of the poll yet?
Yep, just now sharing and launching those. We had about 50% join us here. And it looks like everyone that responded said yes. They do have some sort of link to another website or application.
Yeah, but my guess is it probably isn't one situation. It looks more like this. So, which I would consider unwieldy. So you're dealing with a myriad of tools, some on your website, some on other websites, some on mobile applications, and they're all kind of moving back and forth, and sometimes they're moving one place and not coming back, or they're moving in different ways, and it really creates this disjointed experience for the users, which is even more disjointed for your data, right? Because your data is trying to follow the path. If you are paying for traffic from Google Ads or Facebook, or you're just you run an email campaign, you want to know how these people are moving around, and you want to make sure that they're the same person. So you aren't saying, oh, we had 50 people come and really it was 20. They're just being broken up and reconsidered the new people. So not only I'd assume your data is disjointed between the websites, both yours and your third parties, but your marketing is probably disjointed as well between different channels and tools that track different parts of your data. So the difference between your reporting, your digital marketing reporting and your website is really supported by a robust IT team. And even if the IT team and the marketing team don't always see eye to eye on everything, and I see that a lot in healthcare, there's still a unified effort to control all of the web and app technology. But my guess is that's probably not true for your marketing analytics reporting. Even if you have an analytics team, and I'm sure many of you do, they are likely analysts. So they're focusing on descriptive or some predictive analysis of your data, right? But that you probably don't have very many data architects or data stewards making sure all this disparate data can be used comprehensively. And you can do a lot with just analysts, but you're likely missing some big issues when this data is all over the place. And without the ability to put all these pieces together, you're going to have some big issues that are going to remain hidden. For instance, if users are moving from mobile to desktop and back to make decisions, and you're saying, oh, well, when on desktop, all my traffic's from Google Ads, and that's where they're converting, when in reality, they might be coming from Facebook on your phone, then later seeing the Google ad going to desktop. It's that same person, that whole loop, that whole concept of it takes a lot of different touches to get people to commit. And then you say, oh, well, we're going to cut off our Facebook ads because nobody's doing anything on mobile. And then all of a sudden, things start to tank. You're getting less applications. You're getting less people actually, making appointments. And that's going to be bad for your bottom line. But in addition to all that, we have some other issues really specifically to healthcare, but and beyond when we're wrangling our technologies. We have legislation. So there are very strict rules like the electronic health regulation and HIPAA with extremely stiff penalties. And we have rules in different locations, geographies like California Consumer Privacy Act, the GDPR. They reach beyond their own borders because they can look at the value of your company or where you're targeting users and say that those laws now apply to you. And we even have regulations like the WGAC. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. It really only applies to government websites, but it has a lot of really cool rules on how to accommodate for different levels of human accessibility. Examples are people that are colorblind and making sure your site can be accessible to those audiences, as well as people maybe that are blind and having the right kind of website functionality in place so they can be able to actually use your website. And even though, as I said, those aren't regulations for people outside of the government, they're really good stuff to know and really awesome stuff to have in your site. As I said, all of these regulations, they have good intention. They want to protect users from predatory behavior. And of course, companies like Facebook have a history of towing the line or passing over the line when it comes to the efficacy of customer data. I think in the last decade, it's been an exciting time for collecting all kinds of awesome data about website users. But because some of the players have decided to use this data in ethically questionable ways, it has challenged us to kind of ask, what data do we really need to do our jobs better without compromising the trust of our users? So we have a lot of issues, right? And they all seem different, but I think I can generally sum all this into a single concept. Technical debt. This is basically a concept that was coined in the software development industry that states technical debt is when you solve problems in the short term because it's faster, easier, but it creates issues in the future if you'd used a better approach to start with. The problem is these better approaches tend to take more time and effort up front. So you're trying to like balance out how much effort can I put in now to get a better return in the end. And we see silly technical debt all the time. I see websites using both Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics, and they both require a lot of work to support, and Adobe Analytics is definitely not free. and it just takes a lot of money to support these. And you know what generally happens is they both kind of suffer, and then people try to compare it, and they aren't even the same tools, so the numbers are different. I also see companies using multiple business intelligence tools. Some projects are using Data Studio, and some teams are using Power BI, and some Tableau, and many other reports are in Excel. And as easy as it seems from an outsider to pick, hey, you need to use this single solution, the longer an organization lives like this, the more different teams get entrenched in their software of choice. The CMO wants everything in Excel so she can slice and dice the data, but the CTO loves the beauty of Tableau. And guess what? Most of the company is scared of all these tools and just emails you questions all day. And then what? You're now too busy to fix the problem, and getting everyone on board seems impossible. And the simple truth is, this is the most common issue we find. Disparate data and disparate teams are not playing together, silos are created, and game-changing insights are never found. So if the last 11 slides worried you, you are not alone. Not only is your job probably daunting right now, but the process of moving forward is probably cripplingly scary, right? In my opinion, the best path forward is to find out what is the least you can do to move forward in a meaningful way. And from our experience, it probably looks something like this. So this sort of like MVP process. I'll let you look at that for a second and I'll talk about it. So I'll just walk through these briefly and then we'll cover in detail a couple of them. So the first one, identifying what you need to do your job. So it's very possible you have much of the data you need to do your job right now. It's also possible you are nowhere near what you need. But it's also very likely that you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you need today, let alone what you need in a year and beyond. But here, the thing is, you can start small. You can start with the data you already use and then identify 1 or 2 data points that would make your life better. It could be data that make your job easier, like seeing how much you're spending in all of your channels at once. Or it could be data that help you make you better your job, like showing the sources to drive appointments, hires, or even event signups, so you can manipulate your spend and see how that affects your goals. The second thing is like capturing the data where it lives. So knowing where to find the data is the first half of the battle, and the other half is talking to the right people to get access. Did you know that most data science projects fail? And did you also know that the top reason for failure is lack of access to necessary data? It's not that the data doesn't exist. It's the team is not allowed to access it. Most organizations' top problem with data is they create roadblocks for themselves. So being able to free that data up and talking to the right people is really big. So as much as I kind of say, hey, it's technical debt, the problem here a lot of times is human. And that's kind of gonna be the theme throughout this webinar today, is really we can solve this a lot with human solutions. So the next thing here is creating and implement a data governance policy. So data governance, I think it's the linchpin most organizations are neglecting, but has the most potential to get your measurement in the right place, specifically when dealing multi-touch funnels, and even more specifically with dealing with healthcare data that deserves a high level of scrutiny. So it's one thing to create the governance. It's another thing, number 4, to enforce that policy. It's just a different beast, and that can be really hard to do. So that's another thing we'll kind of touch on here today. And then bringing the data into a single source of what I call truth. And we use truth in kind of lower case T because data is a model. I know Carolyn probably hears me preach about this all the time, that models are a representation of reality, that you kind of need to pick the truth that you believe is closest to accurate, and then stick with that and try to grow from there and create that sense of reality. But data in itself does nothing. You need to analyze it. To get the most out of your disparate data, you need that data in that single place, and you can create relationships and do really amazing stuff. So each of these steps could be a series in a workshop. We're just gonna focus on steps 3 and 5. If you'd like to learn more about any of the other steps, just let Carolyn know. We'll add them to our webinar topics over the summer or fall, and then we'll let you know when you kind of go deeper into some other stuff. But we definitely have a lot of ideas and things. Each one of these, I said, can get pretty in depth. So let's talk about data governance. So, Carrie, go on.
Oh, be sure to drop that either in the chat section, or you can send me an email when I send you the follow-up with the full presentation. You can be sure to reply to that email, and I will make sure that we add that to our list for future topics.
Great. And I apologize if I'm talking fast, trying to get through a lot. I'll try to slow down here as we get into some more technical stuff. So, data governance. In order to understand the user journey, you must create the same rules for all the websites, the apps, the marketing channels. Creating rules and enforcing them to ensure your data is standardized is the easiest way to make your data useful. All data is going to have weaknesses. It's going to have problems. So the more you can eliminate the problems, the better quality your analysis is going to be. This will lead to insights that actually bring value to your organization. There's going to be the worst thing that could happen is you have insights based on faulty data that brings your organization and causes negative things in your organization, because you're going to lose faith from the people within the company, and not only you, but also data analysis. And that's the opposite of what we want to achieve here. So within governance, I find there are kind of two critical types of marketing data that require a pretty strict governance, especially digital marketing data. The first is kind of creating breadcrumbs in your marketing efforts themselves. And so if a user starts from Google search, clicks your website, is doing different activities, you kind of want to pass that data from place to place, not only consistently, but you want to keep that source consistent, but you want to build a hierarchy of source so you can compare, say, email tactics together, social tactic together, or social versus email. The second thing we can do is actually track behavior. And with tools like Google Tag Manager, we can track almost any behavior on your website. It is an incredible tool, amount of data that you could really collect. But as that has blown up in the last like 6 or 8 years, we've also seen that data has gotten completely out of control. And so keeping that data organized is going to be extremely helpful. Otherwise, it's mostly useless. But there's the other thing that in governance we can't neglect, which is the safety and peace of mind of our users. Without that, we're going to run the risk of destroying your credibility, not with our stakeholders, but with the actual customers. And that could be not only detrimental to the company, detrimental to your career. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. So we get that it's very likely that strict governance is something that will not go over well at every organization. I will say that generally healthcare organizations can get buy-in from more aggressive governance a tiny bit easier than, say, a for-profit business. But let's talk about what data governance does to handle sort of the technical debt. So strict governance, it needs to be time sensitive. So you got to have this know it ahead of time. And what you do is you're creating these set of reusable rules across the board. And I'll go into details of what those can kind of look like. And then you need really precise nomenclature. So you're really setting these things up ahead of time before everything starts. And what it does is it allows you to get very basic data processing. The data is processed very quickly and easily and makes sense all across the board. If you don't do strict governance, and I see this all the time, you have this asynchronous way of handling data where like, oh, well, the campaign's up and running. We didn't actually attribute it correctly. We'll fix it later. Oh, we have this event and it changed to that event. Oh, the goal got turned off. All these things kind of changed. We can do that on the fly and we'll change it later and then we'll clean it up afterwards, right? So then you have all these different rules and all these different use cases. I've been there. Oh, well, from February to March, the data looks like this. From April on, it looks another way. Before that, it looks another way. So you have all these special rules. And then you have these really flexible nomenclatures like, oh, sometimes Facebook is capital F, and sometimes it's 2 words, and sometimes it's all lowercase. And so it's kind of all over the place. And what this does is create this really, really lengthful data processing where you're spending 90% of your analyst effort cleaning up the data, which not only takes up a lot of their energy, it also takes up a lot of their love of what they're doing because they're just doing things that really aren't fun. But even worse, it makes it really hard to redo analysis when you've spent all this time cleaning it up. In the worst case, if somebody goes in, oh, well, I did it in Tableau and I cleaned up, then I pulled out in Excel and did some more cleanup, and now I have your report. and you go, oh, well, can you pull it in with an extra week at the beginning? And now oh, well, I don't know what I did in Excel. Now the numbers don't quite line up. And, you know, if you ask someone to do it a month or 6 months later, they may not remember they moved it from one tool to the another. So it becomes a really big problem where you're creating all these specific rules and situations that just kind of like lag everything behind. I know this from experience. This has been my life, many years of my career, and it is not effective for anyone. And it really does destroy credibility because you're just sitting there going, well, I can't do that, or I can't find that number again. It makes you look terrible. It makes your whole team look terrible. And it really is bad for the whole organization. So the first step is making sure you know, is using all those built-in parameters that Google Analytics provides to pass your marketing data from source to your site. And although it's possible to add your own parameters, or even use the existing parameters built in your website that are kind of like functionality of your website to pass info, we find these 5 inputs can actually be expanded to add a lot of critical information by using delimiters. I don't know if you guys are too familiar with this, but if you can look in this sort of content campaign field at the bottom, we're using the pipe to kind of separate a couple of different things here. So we have sort of on the left is sort of like, what is the call to action? Second is the content, the content type, which is a GIF, and then we have the size, and then we have a geo information. So you can use pipes, underscores, or whatever you want as a delimiter, but I like putting it all in there in that campaign content to really build out like what is unique about this particular asset that's being displayed from source to source. So one of the first steps that a lot of things do is like, maybe, go back, you might use this, Google Analytics has this campaign URL builder where you can build one URL at a time. The next step up is usually using something like Google Sheets or Excel. You can set up drop-down rules and now get a little more powerful. I also like using custom IDs for each link. So as you build out a link, it's really nice to have this backup measure. So each ID is unique to that link. So say you put in campaign A for a link, but it's supposed to be campaign B, you ran it, that data is now all stuck in Google Analytics. And it will say this was campaign A, but maybe you can pull it out in a BI tool. You could use that ID and rewrite that. Now, once again, this is sort of like not great governance. And if you had stricter governance and knowing, hey, we are double checking and making sure that that campaign was right before it got out there. But you can kind of put in these kind of checks because mistakes are still going to happen, eliminating as best you can, but then also building in some kind of safeguards there that if a mistake slips through, you're kind of protecting that data. The other cool thing here is now all URLs are saved in a single place. So you can kind of track them down and say like, oh, what did the URL we used on that Facebook campaign 6 months ago? Well, good luck going back to the campaign URL builder. But if you have it in this single set, that's great. Now this is what I was doing a few years ago. What we've moved on to is actually a 2-step process. And the cool thing here is if you use the Microsoft Suite, you can do all of this for free today. So this is really cool. So we save and build the URLs in a custom system. We use SharePoint, so people can come in and go in and click a new URL builder, and they'd say like, oh, is this, we can put in whatever variables we want. We put in branded, non-branded. We put in source. We put in different campaign information, and we don't even have to maybe necessarily ask certain questions like medium. Maybe if we just look at source, we can create rules and say, if it's this source, we know it's X medium. Then after you do that, what goes, I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, it used to be called Flow, but now it's called Microsoft Power Automate. And basically it's a workflow where whenever a new UTM URL comes in, Flow listens for it, picks it up, and then runs through, and we create variables and then build out the URL on the fly and then spit it back out into a SharePoint list. And the cool thing about this is very similar to the Google Sheets or the Excel version where you can now sort through these, but it's actually, instead of just in an Excel sheet, it's actually in a database. So you can do all kinds of cool things and say, okay, I want to see all of the URLs where medium is whatever, and it was from December of 2018. And now you can see just those and pull those into your BI tool and actually cross-reference the specific ID from that URL, as we were saying before, and say, okay, now I need to rewrite this particular situation and clean it up through your BI tool. So that's really fun. So as I said, governance should also apply beyond URLs. It should also apply to behavior tracking. And I actually think in the last 10 years, organizations have gotten much better on URLs and doing a lot of this stuff. I see most organizations using some crude version of a URL builder, whether it's an Excel or some sort of thing like we've custom built where they can actually manage those URLs. I think that's, if you're not doing that, everybody needs to be doing that at this point. But event tracking in Google Analytics is generally a huge mess. With the advent of Google Tag Manager and in Adobe as well is be able to create those kind of custom tags, it's easy to create a lot of events and it becomes messy in a hurry. I've dealt with a lot of organizations that have literally thousands of events firing every single day, and you might have maybe 1,000 pages viewed and you have 5,000 events and you don't know what to do with it. So I think we should start being much more strict on the governance of event categories and actions and labels, and that's something we've been doing a lot more. So you can even see in this particular situation, we have the event categories and event actions, and we're using delimiters here to break this data even more finite than the 3 categories that Google gives us. So in event action, I may have clicked call to action, but then we actually pull in the specific language that was on the button after that pipe. So then I can see, well, what is the difference when the cat version versus the lowercase version? How does that affect conversions? Or, how many more conversions are we getting contact versus contact us versus get in touch with an exclamation point, let's work together. All these different variations, you can come in here and be able to dynamically pull that in as it changes over time and compare how that did. The other thing too is we love to do this in event labels. We're bringing in, say the click class changes. We want to see how that affects it, or even we like to pull in the Google Tag Manager container ID, because it's really interesting to learn, hey, where did this event come from? It is actually pulled in from some API that someone else was messing with and pushing data into your system. Well, then we can come and say, I only want to look at events that have my Google Tag Manager container on it. And that way I know this is my data. And so you can really help QA and track things down better. In the last few months, we've been doing a lot of research on event categories. That's one thing that I've struggled a lot with, is how many categories you'd have and what you should be really using them for. And what I found is there's been a push for only really having 3 categories. And I think this is really, really cool, and I think could be used by a lot of organizations. So this webanalyticsfordevelopers.com, they identified 3 categories that I think are really cool. And basically it's called attract, engage, and convert. And then all of your activities, you would create rules of who goes into what bucket. What I think is really awesome about this is these categories are easy for people in the organization throughout to understand without having to know what the particular activities are. And the actual knowing of the activities and the very, very fine detail, that's for you, for the marketers, for the people that are optimizing it to know. But when you're speaking out about this to the rest of your organization, getting really granular about very specific calls to action, things like that, I'm sure you've experienced where people get caught up in the weeds and they're no longer paying attention to like the big picture stuff. So, and then they don't understand the subtle nuances. And so if we can keep the way we report this out to executives or other teams and saying like, how are we making progress on conversions? How are we getting people more engaged and moving them through that funnel? I think it's going to be a lot easier way to tell the story. And then it's up to you to pull those levers and say, okay, engagement is not hitting where we want. What activities in engagement can we push to get it where we need? And then also creating that connection. What is that connection between engagement and conversion? So what engagement do we need to get to kind of like say, if we get this level of engagement, this is how many conversions we think we're going to get, and creating that relationship there. As you pull back, and this is a hard time for I think a lot of analysts, we want to get really detailed, but pulling back makes it so much easier to tell that story. So getting down to the kind of going beyond that into sort of legislation. So someone who creates blogs, webinars, videos, I hate to say this, but you're not going to get specific solutions to your organization's legal questions from blogs, your peers or webinars or videos. The rules are too complex. The rules change too often. And the rules vary based on location, industry, et cetera. You know that in healthcare. For instance, GDPR. A lot of people are saying, you know, we got this cookie consent banner. How does this apply to me? And it varies greatly from your organization. But guess what? The rules are also in the process. They've been working on it for years of changing it. And they're actually going to try to change it in 2021. I think the quarantine and COVID-19 may have slowed this down, but basically moving to say, instead of having it by website, they want to move it to your browser, and you make that decision at browser level, and then individual websites don't have to have that cookie consent banner. Now, that's going to be a big change coming down the pipe. And when that comes out, you're probably going to know that, because if your legal counsel has decided, hey, we need that cookie consent banner for whatever reason, you can get rid of it now. I think you're going to want to know that, because a lot of those cookie consent banners are basically saying you can't track until somebody accepts it. So you could be losing a ton of important data because people either are not accepting it or not accepting it right away. And either one of those are going to cause a lot of issues with your data quality. So really what this comes down to, the ideal solution is really to bring in a data steward at your organization. So there's a 93% chance that you need to hire a data steward. And this is because polls went out a couple of years ago, I think in 2018, and found that 93% of organizations don't maintain this position. They don't have it at all. And I think it's a really big miss. The data steward will take the lead on creating the data governance plan, ensuring that it's followed. And they'll be responsible for creating processes for how data is collected and ensuring consistency between all brands and platforms. And the quality of your analytics is going to depend greatly upon the data steward. There's one thing you're going to take from this webinar is this data steward. Go research, look more about this, because this role is super duper critical. It's going to make everyone's life so much easier to have it in your organization. And I say, if you don't have it, you are really running behind. And then the reason I put this in the webinar is it's very unlikely that you do. Now, the responsibilities, I said, they create that data governance plan, maybe even creating your data measurement plan and understanding how that all plays together. They're also they're in charge of like making sure there's QA processes for reports, dashboards, and platforms. I could talk for hours and weeks really about data QA, because it's so important and it is such a huge problem. There's nothing worse than creating a report and it has a table with 800 points in it. And now you need to make sure every single one of those points is accurate, because if one point is off, if one point is wrong, that whole conversation when you go to present it is going to be about how that point is wrong, instead of what are you trying to prove? What are you trying to accomplish? And you definitely don't want that. They're also going to create detailed processes and procedures for the collecting, storing, and handling of the data analysis. And that's another thing too. And that's going to be so great if you have analysts or you yourself are doing an analysis, is you're not sitting there trying to wrangle all this data and understand how it goes together. You got this person that's in charge of that, and they're either working with a dev team or a data architect and saying, here's all the rules, here's how we need to lay it out. And so it actually works in a way that makes sense to you. And then ideally they're going to create documentation. Now, documentation, for the sake of documentation, is silly, but documentation of the processes and procedures that are done repeatedly, that other people, so you can grow that and say, hey, I need you to pull this report. I need you to look at this data and answer this question that we have. Being able to hand that off requires processes, because you need things done in a very consistent way. In addition to the laws and the actual governance, the data steward should also think about something else. Is what we're doing icky? So I think the law is the baseline. So even if it's legal, what you're doing, would you be proud if the users found out how you're using their information? So as a healthcare organization, how you use your data is going to be scrutinized heavily for HIPAA violations. This would focus mostly on electronic health information in our case, but even then, you may have data that you have collected and used but might not be something your users would be happy about. And even if you're not intentionally using it and it's not malicious, you can still be collecting and using data in very questionable ways. I mean, the Amazon used an API to help hiring people. And what it did was it looked at how Amazon already was, and it wasn't this, it wasn't that the model was intentionally sexist, it's that Amazon itself hired mostly men. So what did it do? It looked at the colleges they went to and found that if you went to a women's college, you're not going to get hired. So it removes anyone that went to a women's college. I mean, that's definitely not what their intent was, but that's how the model worked. It was just modeling their behavior. And then once that got out, even though what they did was perfectly legal, it did not look good to the people that are their customers as well as their stakeholders. The other thing is, this one with the mailer that OfficeMax sent out. It wasn't intentional. It's just information was collected in a way and then reused. And when they looked at all this, deep down in the data, there's some data in there that really wasn't appropriate to be used. And I would even say even within personal health data, it's not all treated the same. If you might work at a healthcare network and think, we have very strict rules of HIPAA, but organizations like Ancestry.com, they've decided they don't need to follow HIPAA regulations, and they are allowed to share your DNA data with third parties. And not only can they do this, this is actually a core part of their business model. So thinking about that ickiness of saying like, oh, they're using their data and just my DNA data or my mother or someone else in my family gave it to them. Now, Ancestry.com is selling it to whomever to do whatever they want with it. And that's really scary. So let's say you have the sort of the naming convention in a really good place. You have that data steward. Can you trust that you have the right numbers, like users and sessions? And can you use these numbers to make insights and improve your organization? So in that vein, I think about a single source of truth and trying to get that source of truth as accurate as possible. To do that, one place is there's really no perfect model, but I think about three things, and this is really Google Analytics focused, but you can apply it to other tools like Snowplow or Adobe Analytics, which is this cross-domain tracking, which is the idea of as users move to domain, those third-party domains, that whole big system we showed earlier, is that same person is tracked throughout as the same ID. The second thing is cross-device tracking. This is much, much harder, but in the last year, there's been some good progress with that. And this is, even if I'm not logging in, or if I'm logging in, is a lot easier, but basically knowing, hey, person X was just on their smartphone and a week later they're on their desktop. That's the same person, so that's the same experience. Like, definitely don't think about sessions. I think about users and how they're applying through your system. And then the last thing is like putting it all together in business intelligence and basically having a tool so you can do that sort of diagnostics and additional predictive modeling as well, to be able to pull all that data in one place and really slice and dice it from all these different systems. Because as I said, having to go through all these different websites is one thing. Having to pull all these different tools together for your report is extremely frustrating. And if you can just go to one place, it's going to make everyone's life so much easier. So cross-domain tracking, sometimes there's a lot of confusion about this, so I definitely wanted to create a little clarification here. So it's about tracking the same user's cookie from website to website so you can identify the original source of that user. So the thing to note here is a cookie, right? It's not necessarily the user, it's that little cookie in their browser. So as they move from site to site, we basically need that ID to come with them so we can say, oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over there. But the first thing to know about cross-domain tracking is many times you actually don't need it because it's designed as you go from a website to a completely different website. But there's two common ways you can kind of avoid using cross-domain tracking at all, which I think is pretty cool. So if you're using subdomains, and I see this all the time, people put all these subdomains cross-domain tracking in there. It's completely unnecessary because Google Analytics cookie is stored at the top level domain. So it doesn't matter if a user visits www your site or shop.your site, volunteer.your site or whatever, as long as it's using that same website.com, it's always going to use that same cookie, which is really good to know. So that's all built in off the bat. So I see a struggle with that. And it's a good advice too, that whenever possible, use subdomains instead of using a whole different domain when you're, say, creating a special event, or you're creating a landing page, or your shopping cart. If you can make it a subdomain in your own site, it's going to make the tracking a much easier and much more consistent. The second is when you have a third-party tool and it's really hard to get tracking on. I see this all the time, and we'll fight, and sometimes we will lose that battle and we can't get the Google Analytics tracking on that site. And so the thing you can do is you really just want to skip it all together. So they have this really process and Google in the Google Analytics admin called referral exclusion. And so what you do is, say someone goes to your site and they goes off-site to, whatever appointment tool. When they get finished, if you can have them link and redirect back to a thank you page, what you can do in the referral exclusion is basically ignore, Google Analytics will ignore when they left the site and when they, and that process of coming back. So all Google sees is they were on page A, and then they clicked off, but you don't see any of that, and then they see they got to a thank you page, and so it still sees that same user came to page A and then got to a thank you page, but it also sees that it came from Facebook or Google or whoever, instead of saying, oh, well, you got a conversion, but it came from your appointment tool. Well, that doesn't tell you very much information about the source, the original source of what drove that traffic. So that referral exclusion is just a really simple thing, but it's really powerful and we love using it. So if you do decide, hey, cross-domain tracking does apply to us, we're sending people to a completely different website, we can set up tracking there. I always say use Google Tag Manager whenever possible if you're using Google products. You can set up the cross-domain tracking in Google Analytics, but it's much easier to do in Google Tag Manager. Not only, you don't need to know JavaScript, but there's really only these 4 things you need to do. So you just want to make sure everything's tracked in the same Google Analytics property. Otherwise, that's not cross-domain tracking. It's just different properties. Once again, referral exclusion, making sure you're excluding that, which means when somebody comes to your site and goes to the other site, it sees that first, say, Facebook, your site 1, your site 2. When it gets to your site 2, it still says you came from Facebook, not site 1. Does that make sense? That referral exclusion rate, when you look at them, you actually want to make sure it's actually passing that Google Analytics ID, which usually has that GA equals, and that's the cookie ID, and that's defining it. And then there's sort of these little things like autolinker, and you want to set that to true. And basically what that does is both the domain that's on is going to tag the links, and then the target domain is actually going to pick it up and say, oh, okay, that's that cookie. Thank you for, if it wrote a cookie, it'll override it with that same cookie. So if you want to know more about this, this is on simoavanas.com's website. He is like the GTM legend. He knows everything about this stuff. So that's a great source for looking at this stuff. But you guys reach out to Carolyn if you guys have questions individually about it. I could do a whole webinar just about cross-domain tracking. So we're almost done here. So cross-device tracking is extremely difficult. The main way we solve it is having a login. And so basically you would have an application, think your Amazon account, and you're logging in there so that way you can see all the products you have, whether or not you're on your desktop or your phone. Facebook's another thing. You log into Facebook and you use that tool across the things, and then that Facebook or Amazon can stitch all that together and say, because of that ID, that's the same person. And if I was using an analytics tool, I would just pull that ID out of the cookies or the DOM and be able to attach that to Google Analytics and say, this is their ID. And as they move from system to system, we know it's the same person, even though they're on a phone one day and their desktop the next day. But unfortunately, in a lot of healthcare situations, you don't have that option. Maybe you do with, like, say, MyChart, but a lot of organizations struggle to get tracking on MyChart because of both their general counsel is terrified of it, or you might even worried about how you're using that data, or you just don't have the technical chops to get it on there. But even then, you will want an ID in all places. So if you only have it in MyChart, but people are just using the other parts of your site, that doesn't help either. So there is sort of an option within Google Analytics. They came out, I want to say a little less than 2 years ago, called Google Signals. And what it does, it's really cool. All you have to do is kind of just turn it on, and it will use your Google, like your Gmail account, your Google account, to be able to identify the users, and then Google will stitch those users together and say, hey, I know this is user 1 and user 2, but I see that they're actually the same, and stitches those together all in the back end, so you don't have to do anything for that. So Google Signals is really powerful in terms of stitching those together, and I think it applies to a lot of people, because if they use Gmail, if they use Google Ads, if they use Google Analytics, if they use YouTube or any other Google product and have an account, they're probably logged into it on their browser across all their devices, and Google can start to stitch those people together. I know Chrome is the top browser right now still, and I know almost everyone is using YouTube, and a lot of people are using Gmail. So you're going to catch a lot of users this way. It's not a perfect model, and never is, but it's going to be very effective at stitching those people together into one unified person, which is pretty cool. So you get all the good data, it's clean, it's connected, but good data is sort of useless if you don't use it. So this is sort of like the end cap here. And so remember when I talked about delimiters for Google Analytics and the UTM parameters earlier? Well, if we can put it all in a BI tool, not only can you use that existing data, but it really shines because you can start breaking things out in really cool ways. So let's say, for instance, you have a city as your geography. So you have St. Louis and Chicago and Memphis. I'm in the Midwest, so those are just cities that come to mind. But you can actually create additional fields about that. Say you could say, what's the healthcare network we're running in St. Louis versus Nashville? Or we could just run it by state and say, how does Missouri look across, Missouri or St. Louis and Kansas City and Springfield? How is that all grouped together? So you can create those additional things, or even regions. Oh, St. Louis is also part of, Illinois. So what are those Illinois things that might be in the same healthcare network? How you can group that all together and see that data in one way that you wouldn't be able to see maybe in Google Analytics, because it's not really built around your healthcare network, right? But at the end of the day, all this cool data, you can do a lot of different things here, and you can create new ways to organize that data that really be able to tell your story a lot better. But the thing that I found is everybody wants to jump into it and create this really complicated solution right off the bat, and you create technical debt. And guess what? I think that the answer isn't that way. So there's a thing called Gall's Law. It's been around for a few decades. And basically, the Gall's Law's concept is sometimes complex systems work, but building one from scratch, it never works. I always start small. At some point, you will have a complex system analysis. You will have your custom tool to crack your URLs, and you'll have governance. And we use a lot of really cool things to track all of our events, and we push it all through our BI tool and create those relationships and say, for instance, healthcare network, we've created that healthcare network based off the geo in our UTM parameters. Well, now we can cross-reference that with healthcare network out of our actual appointment system to say, how many appointments were there in Cleveland, and can cross-reference us and say, okay, well, how does that affect over time? Or how can we break those things out and create that relationship? But that's down the road. If you just need to answer your individual questions now, don't try to build out that big system. Just start small. You just have the most useful data, because I find useful data is much, much better than a lot of data. And if I had 2 data points that I knew inside and out and I trusted, I think it's much more useful than 100 data points that I got to do a lot of work with to get anything out of. So that's essentially what I have today. I realize I talked and talked and talked, but if there's about 5 minutes left for any additional questions or whatever topics you guys wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so thank you, Brett, for that. Very informative. I hope you guys all learned something. I know I did. I learned something new every time. We have a question from Karen. She asked, are there any resources that you can recommend for CCPA and GDPR?
Yeah,
And is that something that if you want to maybe think about it and I can put in the follow-up email as well?
Yeah, I would say that I think we could do a follow-up email just because when we get in with those kind of things, there's a lot of legal hurdles. And I don't want to give any recommendation to say, hey, this is your one true source for that stuff. And I think even between the two of them, they're not always consistent. And as I said, GDPR, it's really crazy because GDPR is actually a set of rules that goes and apply for the EU, but each EU country can actually enforce it differently, which is even crazier. So it's not GDPR is one thing; it's actually 35 different implementations of it. So it's quite crazy and scary to deal with.
That totally makes sense. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat section or the Q&A. I actually had something that came up as well for marketing and sales. When we talk about a lot of these conversion funnels and pushing people through the funnel to actually become a new patient or fill out an appointment contact, how much do you think marketing and sales should be working together to build that engagement and conversion governance? And then kind of going back to having a governance person within an organization. For the organizations that don't feel like they can just have a governance person, do we feel like we can combine that with another job title? Like, can the director of marketing also be the governance person, or what are your thoughts behind that?
I mean, I think that's possible. I think it's the governance. I think the governance person needs to wear multiple hats just because it's generally a loss leader. It's hard to pay for that, and it's usually can be an expensive position, especially in organizations. Say you have less than 1,000 people, it can be hard to say that person or that team. So one of the things that I do find a lot in organizations, especially healthcare, is you probably already have some governance departments over your healthcare data, but not your marketing data, and tapping into that group and see if they can start pulling in and being in charge of that. There's another concept called Center of Excellence that a lot of it's for-profit businesses like like Amazon or whatever might be using, but it's basically this concept of you sort of have this central governing body of everything and signing rules of not only for the governance, but also what type of analytics tools we use and what type of analysis we're doing beyond marketing for your whole company. And I think that's something that you could probably tap into because my guess between a research department or as I said, the actual healthcare data, there's probably already teams in place that kind of work there so they could at least put you in the right direction. Because I do sometimes feel like healthcare organizations sort of, they forget about marketing data and forget how much of it is and how important it is. And the worst thing you want to do is caught red-handed and be like, hey, what's going on with this data? And we're like, oh, we don't really have any rules. And it's going to look really dangerous and somebody else is going to come in and swoop and take control over you, which is probably not something you want.
That makes complete sense. Well, we are right at the last couple minutes here. I just wanted to, again, thank you all for joining us. When you guys actually click out of the webinar, you should see a poll pop up. It is literally 5 questions. We would love to hear if your audio worked, if you liked the content, and any other ideas that you have for future webinars that you'd like to see. Keep an eye out in your inbox for that recording, and we hope we'll check out our future webinars as well as our YouTube page, and we'll make sure to include all of that information as well. And we hope that you have a great afternoon. Thank you, Brett. I think everyone gives a big quarantine round of applause to Brett here as he finishes up. So be sure to ask us any questions coming up, and we hope that you have a great afternoon. Bye, everybody.